Welcome, dear friends, to Willowbrook, a village glowing under a blanket of fresh snow, where each cottage roof sparkles like sugar on gingerbread, and lanterns cast a warm, golden glow along the quiet streets. From her favorite armchair by the crackling hearth, Miss Marple lifts her knitting and smiles, the firelight dancing in her keen eyes. "Ah, Christmas Eve," she says softly. "Even in the happiest of gatherings, secrets can hide quietly, like little presents tucked beneath the tree." And so begins our tale, the mystery of the missing Christmas guest. She leans in with gentle curiosity, inviting you to step inside the village and wonder, what mysteries might this festive night conceal? The annual Christmas party at Lady Agatha Farnsworth's grand Willowbrook Manor was, as always, the highlight of the season. Candlelight danced upon polished mahogany tables, and the scent of spiced cakes and roasting chestnuts mingled with the crisp winter air drifting in from the frosted windows. Villagers chatted amiably, exchanging gossip and compliments with the easy charm that only a small, close-knit community could afford. Yet, despite the warmth and merriment, a subtle unease lingered. Miss Marple, seated quietly in a corner with her knitting basket resting beside her, observed the scene with calm, keen eyes. The laughter and music flowed around her, yet she noticed the slight frowns and furtive glances of several guests. One absence was particularly conspicuous. Mr. Theodore Brightwell, a distant cousin of the Farnsworth family, had not yet arrived, and with each passing moment, the tension quietly grew. At precisely 10 o'clock, a piercing scream cut through the festive chatter. A young servant, pale and trembling, held a crumpled note in her hand, its words warning of imminent danger. Shock rippled through the room, whispers and speculation rising like smoke from the hearth. The constable hurriedly began his investigation, while Miss Marple, calm as ever, sensed that beneath the cheerful holiday facade, a far more intricate mystery was quietly unfolding. Chapter 1. Whispers by the Holly Tree. The market square of Willowbrook on the morning after Lady Agatha Farnsworth's Christmas party was alive with a curious mixture of festivity and unease. Snow still clung to the rooftops and lamp-posts, glittering like scattered diamonds in the pale winter sun, while the scent of fresh bread and roasting chestnuts mingled with the crisp air. Villagers bustled about, exchanging parcels, cheerful greetings, and, as always in a place so small and so tightly knit, gossip. Miss Marple strolled slowly among them, her shawl wrapped snugly around her shoulders and her knitting tucked neatly in her basket. She had promised herself only a brief outing to gather her weekly supplies, yet the hum of speculation drew her in. Conversation stopped and restarted as eyes darted toward her, for no one was more adept at listening without being noticed than Miss Marple herself. "Did you hear?" whispered Mrs. Pritchard, the baker's wife, clutching her parcel of mince pies. "Theodore Brightwell hasn't been seen since the party. Some say it's a family feud. He and Lady Agatha's nephew, James, have been at odds for months." "Oh, I've heard something else," murmured Mrs. Simmons, who ran the flower stall. "I'm told Brightwell is under some dreadful debt, though no one mentions it openly. Wouldn't surprise me if he disappeared on purpose." Miss Marple's eyes flicked from one face to another, noting the subtle twitch of an eyebrow, the almost imperceptible tightening of lips. Beneath the polite chatter, a tension simmered. Old resentments, whispered suspicions, and the fragile pride of Willowbrook's inhabitants all mingled with the festive cheer. She sensed that the villagers' gossip, though lively and seemingly trivial, held small shards of truth about human nature and motive. The knitting needles clicked softly in her hands as she considered the patterns forming in the village's conversation. Holiday cheer, she thought, was often a mask, and behind the laughter and seasonal bustle, the currents of rivalry and secrecy ran deep. As she moved along the stalls, Miss Marple quietly resolved to watch and listen, for in these small gestures and hushed remarks lay the first clues of the mystery yet to unfold. By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple had made her way to the vicarage, where the aroma of fresh scones and steaming tea welcomed her. The vicar, a kind man with a perpetually worried brow, poured her a cup with gentle ceremony, while the vicar's wife bustled about, arranging delicate porcelain cakes on a silver tray. Outside, the snow lay thick on the garden paths, glinting under the pale winter sun, and the faint chime of the church bells drifted through the frosted windows. Miss Marple settled into her accustomed chair, her knitting basket at her side, and took a quiet sip of tea. Around her, friends and neighbors engaged in animated discussion, each eager to share their theory of Mr. Theodore Brightwell's mysterious absence. "Perhaps he simply got delayed on the road," suggested Mrs. Pritchard, trying to sound reassuring. "Oh, but it seems odd for him not to send a note," countered Mrs. Simmons, her hands wringing a delicate lace handkerchief. The vicar himself looked uneasy, fidgeting with his spectacles, as though he doubted even the most plausible explanations. Miss Marple, ever observant, allowed the conversation to flow around her while her mind quietly picked out subtle inconsistencies. A servant, standing near the fireplace, kept glancing toward the door with a nervous, almost furtive expression. On the mantelpiece, a decorative trinket seemed slightly askew, as though disturbed in haste. Tiny details, she knew, often spoke louder than the loudest claims or conjectures. As the discussions continued, Miss Marple's sharp mind pieced together a tentative pattern. These small irregularities, the nervous glance, the displaced ornament, planted the first seeds of doubt in her mind. Something, she sensed, was amiss. This was no ordinary delay. Beneath the polite chatter and warm tea lay a subtle current of tension, hinting at secrets hidden within the very heart of Willowbrook. Quietly, she resolved to watch and listen more closely, for the smallest observations often revealed the largest truths. By late afternoon, Willowbrook lay under a pristine blanket of snow, each cottage roof gleaming like sugar in the soft light of the winter sun. The streets, dusted and white, seemed almost enchanted, and the village square sparkled with wreaths of holly and clusters of twinkling lanterns. Children's laughter echoed faintly as they trudged through the drifts, while smoke curled lazily from chimneys, carrying the warm scent of baking bread and roasting chestnuts. All appeared idyllic, yet Miss Marple, walking along the quiet lane, knew better than to trust appearances entirely. Her shawl wrapped snugly about her shoulders, knitting basket in hand, she made her way past the Farnsworth estate, where the Christmas decorations glimmered with meticulous care. As she passed the garden gate, her sharp eyes caught something unusual in the fresh snow. Footprints, too large and too irregular to belong to the usual household staff, leading toward the back of the manor. The impressions were faint but unmistakable, and their sudden ending near a hedge hinted at haste or secrecy. Miss Marple paused, letting her gaze sweep the surroundings. She noted the faint tilt of a lantern, a wreath slightly askew, and a small spatter of mud near the doorstep. Details that might easily go unnoticed by a casual observer. Yet to her experienced eye, they formed a silent narrative, suggesting someone had moved through the grounds under cover of festive cheer. She continued her stroll, allowing the village's charm to mask her keen scrutiny. Though the scene was picturesque, she understood that beauty often concealed tension, and the cheerful holiday trappings could hide far darker intentions. Quietly, Miss Marple resolved to gather more information before drawing conclusions. In Willowbrook, she knew, the truth rarely arrived openly. It revealed itself slowly, in footprints, glances, and the subtlest of gestures. Tonight, she decided she would watch carefully and listen even more closely. Chapter 2: Candles and Clues. The Farnsworth drawing room, still softly illuminated by the flickering glow of the Christmas tree, held an air of quiet disarray the morning after the party. Ornaments glittered in the candlelight. Tinsel hung slightly askew, and a scattering of pine needles carpeted the polished wooden floor. Servants moved discreetly, tidying up while avoiding the lingering tension that had settled over the household like a thin veil. It was there, amid the displaced baubles and crumpled gift ribbons, that a small, torn envelope caught Miss Marple's attention. The envelope had evidently been hidden behind the tree in haste, its edges jagged and uneven, as though torn by someone in nervous agitation. Carefully, she gathered the fragments, noting the delicate handwriting that suggested both haste and a hidden tremor. When she brought the pieces together, she recognized the familiar scrawl of Mr. Theodore Brightwell. The note was brief, yet the choice of words struck her, unusually formal, tinged with a strain of urgency, and imbued with a subtle, almost imperceptible bitterness. Even more intriguing was the faint scent that clung to the paper, a gentle fragrance of lavender, the sort often associated with old letters or carefully preserved stationery. Miss Marple inhaled softly, allowing the detail to settle in her mind. It was a personal touch, one that spoke not merely of correspondence, but of intimacy, trust, and perhaps a simmering disagreement that no one else had noticed. She pondered the implications as she held the note, realizing that this simple envelope hinted at a conflict far closer than any of the village gossip suggested. Others might overlook such subtleties, focusing only on the more dramatic delays, absences, or loud confrontations. But Miss Marple knew that human nature often revealed itself in the quietest of ways. This torn message, tucked behind a festive tree, was more than a piece of paper. It was a fragment of truth waiting patiently for someone with a keen eye to uncover. And Miss Marple intended to do just that. Miss Marple found the young maid hovering near the drawing-room doorway, her hands clasped tightly before her, fingers entwined as if for comfort. The girl's cheeks were flushed from both the chill of the morning and the anxiety that radiated from her every movement. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she whispered, bowing her head slightly, her voice trembling despite the effort to sound composed. "Good morning, my dear," Miss Marple replied gently, settling into a chair nearby. "Might I ask you a few questions about Mr. Brightwell?" The girl nodded quickly, biting her lip, but her eyes darted nervously around the room as though searching for an escape. Miss Marple spoke softly, her tone soothing, careful not to frighten the maid further, knowing that alarm often obscured the truth more effectively than guilt ever could. The maid's answers were halting, inconsistent. At first, she insisted she had seen nothing unusual that evening. Yet moments later, she admitted glimpsing Mr. Brightwell near the stables, though the times she mentioned contradicted earlier statements. Each avoidance of direct eye contact, each fidgeting gesture, was a clue Miss Marple stored away, silently noting the tension beneath the girl's polite demeanor. Miss Marple's mind worked quietly, connecting these small observations. The nervous glance when mentioning the Farnsworth nephew, the hesitation before acknowledging a visitor at the rear entrance, all suggested that the maid knew more than she dared admit, though it was far from clear whether she was hiding knowledge through fear or loyalty. By the end of their brief conversation, Miss Marple thanked the girl warmly, offering a reassuring smile. "Do not worry, my dear. You've been very helpful." The maid relaxed slightly, yet Miss Marple knew that even in this calm, the smallest inconsistencies, the shifting gaze, the trembling hands, spoke volumes. Often, it was not the loud declarations, but the quiet, unguarded moments that revealed the deepest truths, and Miss Marple was patient enough to notice them all. As twilight deepened over the Farnsworth estate, the soft glow of the Christmas tree and flickering candlelight cast long, dancing shadows across the polished floorboards. The air was tinged with the scent of pine and burning wax, and the faint crackle of the fire added a rhythmic warmth to the otherwise still house. Miss Marple, her shawl drawn tightly about her shoulders, wandered slowly through the rooms, her eyes keenly observing the interplay of light and shadow as it played across familiar furniture and festive decorations. Her gaze settled on the arrangement of ornaments on the grand Christmas tree. At first glance, they seemed randomly placed: silver bells, crimson baubles, tiny carved figurines. Yet Miss Marple noticed a subtle, almost imperceptible pattern. Certain ornaments were clustered in a manner that echoed old disputes she remembered from years past, a silent reminder of rivalries that had once divided the village. A particular pair of figurines, a gilded angel and a carved shepherd, stood apart, positioned as though in opposition, while a small cluster of bells seemed to emphasize the distance between them. She paused to consider the significance. Most visitors would see only a charming display, a cheerful ornamentation befitting a festive season. But Miss Marple understood that human behavior often expressed itself unconsciously in patterns. The placement of objects, the choice of colors, the way space was used. These subtle gestures could betray underlying resentments, loyalties, or warnings. Messages hidden in plain sight for those who care to notice. Quietly, she made a mental note of the arrangement, linking it in her mind to the personalities involved in the recent turmoil. What seemed like a trivial holiday decoration now suggested a hidden dialogue, a silent reflection of long-standing grudges and alliances. In Willowbrook, as she had long observed, even the smallest details could illuminate the deepest truths, if only one took the time to see them. Miss Marple's evening stroll had already begun to reveal secrets that others, distracted by the cheer and candlelight, would never suspect. Chapter 3. The Butler's Secret. The morning air was crisp and biting as Constable Harris, a stout man with a reputation for swift decisions, arrived at the Farnsworth estate. The villagers had gathered along the winding drive, their breath visible in the frosty light, murmuring with excitement and relief. Today, they believed justice would be done. At the center of the assembly, the Farnsworth butler, Mr. Collins, stood with a rigid posture, his expression a mixture of confusion and quiet indignation. "Mr. Collins," announced Constable Harris, his voice carrying across the frost-kissed courtyard, "you are to be taken into custody in connection with the disappearance of Mr. Theodore Brightwell." A murmur of approval ran through the assembled villagers. Whispers of jealousy, ambition, and hidden resentments had already colored their opinions, and many were eager to see a culprit publicly identified. "It had to be him," one villager muttered to another. "Who else could have a motive?" Miss Marple, standing slightly apart with her knitting basket tucked under her arm, observed the scene with calm detachment. She noted the villagers' eager nods and the way their eyes flicked from the butler to the constable, satisfied that the mystery seemed resolved. Yet beneath the surface, she perceived something amiss. Certain inconsistencies in the testimonies and the butler's defensive manner suggested that appearances could be deceptive. The constable's confidence, while outwardly reassuring, did not account for subtle details. The slight hesitation before answering a question, the unusual timing of certain events, or the faint traces of footprints in the snow that did not match the butler's routine movements. While the villagers whispered and speculated, Miss Marple's mind quietly catalogued every irregularity. She understood that human behavior often concealed more than it revealed, and that fear, respect, or even innocence could all produce misleading signs. Though Mr. Collins was now under arrest, and the crowd seemed content, she knew the truth was rarely so simple. The missing guest's disappearance would not be explained by haste or surface judgments. As the butler was led away, Miss Marple resolved to continue her own observations, certain that the real story lay beneath the polished facade of propriety and the eager assumptions of Willowbrook's residents. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple sent a discreet note to Mr. Collins, inviting him to her small sitting room for tea. The butler arrived promptly, his usually impeccable composure slightly frayed, and bowed stiffly as he entered. "Thank you for seeing me, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, as though afraid the walls themselves might overhear. The elderly detective gestured to a comfortable chair beside the fire, offering a warm smile that immediately softened the tension in the room. As the kettle hissed and the rich aroma of brewed tea filled the space, Miss Marple began her gentle inquiry. She asked about minor details of the party, the placement of certain ornaments, the timing of the servant shifts, and the arrival of unusual visitors. Mr. Collins answered, yet his replies were cautious, sometimes contradictory, and often laden with hesitation. He avoided eye contact at moments that seemed innocuous to others, a subtle tell that did not escape Miss Marple's observant gaze. She allowed the conversation to flow naturally, careful not to alarm him. Her questions were casual, the kind a neighbor might ask over a cup of tea, yet each response was catalogued in her mind like pieces of a delicate puzzle. The butler's nervous fidgeting, the way his hands tightened around his teacup, and the brief pause before correcting himself, all indicated anxiety, though not necessarily guilt. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to psychological motives. If Mr. Collins were innocent, then someone else must have engineered the disappearance, carefully manipulating the circumstances so that the butler appeared culpable. Her mind traced the invisible threads connecting fear, loyalty, and deception, noting patterns the constable had overlooked. By the time tea was finished, Miss Marple had quietly reaffirmed her belief. The true culprit remained hidden, clever enough to divert suspicion while leaving subtle traces of their intent. In Willowbrook, she reflected, the smallest gestures often betrayed the most calculated plans, and she intended to follow them wherever they might lead. Later that morning, as Miss Marple wandered once more through the Farnsworth estate under the guise of checking on small household matters, her attention was drawn to a modest desk in the corner of the drawing room. Its surface was immaculate, save for a few scattered papers, yet the drawer beneath, slightly ajar, seemed to call for closer inspection. With the softest touch, she eased it open and discovered a small stack of letters, yellowed at the edges and tied together with a faded ribbon. The letters were correspondence between Mr. Theodore Brightwell and another villager, the name faintly scribbled in ink that had aged to a deep brown. As Miss Marple read, she noted a mounting tension in the phrasing, carefully chosen words that masked irritation, veiled threats, and veiled entreaties. The letters spoke of money owed, accounts unsettled, and promises that had been broken, all wrapped in the polite veneer characteristic of Willowbrook's genteel society. Beneath the formal tone, however, the letters revealed a simmering personal conflict, one that neither party had dared to disclose openly. Miss Marple paused to consider the implications. The butler, attentive and discreet, had been an easy target for suspicion, his daily presence in the household and his natural deference making him appear involved in matters he had no hand in. The letters, however, suggested that the true friction lay elsewhere, between two adults with motives less visible but far more compelling. She examined the subtle cues, the carefully measured words, the tiny exclamations or omissions that hinted at frustration and resentment. Each sentence, each turn of phrase, painted a portrait of strained relationships and hidden grievances. It became clear to Miss Marple that the missing guest's disappearance had been engineered in a calculated attempt to manipulate appearances, using the butler as a convenient scapegoat while the real instigator remained unseen. Tucking the letters carefully back into the drawer, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, knowing smile. The puzzle was slowly taking shape. Where others saw confusion and coincidence, she saw intent, strategy, and human foibles, clues that would guide her toward the truth, one quiet observation at a time. Chapter 4. Snowed-in Secrets. The morning sun cast a silvery light over Willowbrook, glinting on the fresh snow that carpeted the village streets. The world seemed peaceful, almost untouched, yet Miss Marple knew that beneath this pristine surface lay currents of tension, subtle but enduring. She had been walking among the villagers, exchanging polite greetings and observing carefully, when fragments of conversation began to reveal more than casual chatter. At the market, Mrs. Pritchard mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that she had noticed Lady Agatha Farnsworth speaking in hushed tones with Mrs. Vintner, the matriarch of the neighboring family, long considered rivals of the Farnsworths. Their families had once competed for influence and favor in the village, a rivalry that had cooled in appearance but clearly had not vanished entirely. Miss Marple listened closely, noting the quick glance of Mrs. Vintner's youngest daughter toward the Farnsworth estate and the subtle tightening of her lips when the subject of the Christmas party arose. Later, she overheard snippets of conversation in the vicarage tea-room. "It's curious," remarked Mrs. Simmons, "how certain old debts and disagreements never truly die." Miss Marple's mind began to weave together these threads, recognizing the familiar patterns of rivalry. Polite exchanges that masked tension, compliments edged with subtle disdain, gestures that suggested control or superiority. To the casual observer, these were ordinary village manners. To Miss Marple, they were the faint footprints of grudges, carefully hidden but persistently present. By the time she returned home, knitting needles in hand and tea steaming beside her, Miss Marple had a clear sense of the undercurrent behind Mr. Brightwell's disappearance. The cheerful facades, the laughter and festive decorations, and the cordial greetings of Willowbrook villagers were all masks. Beneath them lay rivalries, past betrayals, and silent competitions that had endured for decades. Miss Marple smiled softly to herself, knowing that where others saw only holiday cheer, she saw a tapestry of motives and grudges, each waiting patiently for the right moment to reveal its influence on the present mystery. Night had fallen over Willowbrook, blanketing the village in silence except for the occasional crunch of snow beneath a careful footstep. The Farnsworth estate glowed warmly from within, the flickering lights of the Christmas tree spilling through frosted windows, while the gardens outside were cloaked in shadow. Miss Marple, wrapped snugly in her shawl and carrying a small lantern, moved silently along the edge of the estate, her sharp eyes scanning for anything unusual. Behind a thick stand of holly bushes, she noticed two figures moving cautiously, their voices low and urgent. She crouched behind the greenery, listening carefully without being seen. The conversation revealed hints of a clandestine plan, a subtle manipulation of the Christmas gathering meant to divert attention and create confusion. Certain phrases, lightly spoken, suggested an intimate knowledge of the household's routines and the villagers' habits, indicating that this was no impulsive scheme, but a carefully orchestrated maneuver. Miss Marple paid particular attention to the tone and timing of their words. One figure laughed softly, a nervous, calculated sound, while the other's voice carried hints of irritation and impatience. Every pause, every glance, seemed to carry meaning beyond the spoken phrases. She noted the direction of movement, the gestures, and the careful avoidance of the garden's main paths. Each detail, seemingly insignificant, added layers to the understanding of the plan unfolding before her. By the time the two figures parted and disappeared into the night, Miss Marple had quietly cataloged the entire scene. She understood the importance of context, of when and where actions took place, and how subtle timing could influence the outcome of events. Back in the warmth of her sitting room, she reflected on what she had witnessed. The hidden meeting confirmed her suspicions. The disappearance of Mr. Brightwell was not a simple misfortune, nor the fault of the easily accused. A deliberate hand was at work, and she now had a clearer glimpse of the strings being pulled behind the cheerful holiday facade of Willowbrook. The morning after the late-night meeting, Willowbrook lay quiet under another pristine layer of snow. Miss Marple, wrapped in her thickest shawl, made her way toward the Farnsworth estate, her eyes scanning the grounds with deliberate care. As she reached the carriage drive, her attention was drawn to a set of tracks pressed into the snow, fresh, crisp impressions that had gone unnoticed by the household staff. The marks revealed the sudden arrival of a carriage, its wheels and horses' hooves leaving a clear pattern, one that did not match any scheduled visitor or familiar servant route. Miss Marple knelt briefly to study the tracks, noting the hurried, uneven impressions of the driver's steps. The carriage had come unexpectedly, and the subtle signs of haste suggested that its arrival had not been welcome, or at least had not been anticipated. The tracks led to the rear of the estate, where shadows lingered among the holly bushes and the snow had been trampled in a small, confined area. These small disturbances, invisible to casual eyes, spoke volumes to Miss Marple. She began to reconstruct the sequence of events in her mind. If the carriage had arrived unannounced, it might explain Mr. Brightwell's disappearance, implying that he had been persuaded or forced to leave under duress. The meticulous timing of this clandestine arrival suggested premeditation, a manipulation designed to confuse the household and conceal the true circumstances of his departure. Walking slowly along the drive, Miss Marple connected these traces to what she had already observed. The hidden meeting in the garden, the torn note behind the Christmas tree, the inconsistencies in the butler's testimony. Each clue now fit together like pieces of a puzzle, revealing a pattern of calculated interference. While the villagers speculated and the constable focused on the obvious, Miss Marple quietly traced the invisible lines of cause and effect. The carriage tracks had opened a new window into the mystery, giving her the first real insight into the unseen forces that had disrupted Willowbrook's serene holiday. Chapter 5. Mistletoe and Misunderstandings. The tranquility of Willowbrook was shattered mid-morning by the sudden clamor of alarmed voices echoing from the Farnsworth kitchens. A small fire had erupted near the hearth, sending plumes of smoke curling into the air and causing a rush of servants and villagers to stamp and fan at the flames. Though quickly brought under control, the incident stirred anxiety throughout the estate, the cheerful holiday atmosphere momentarily replaced by murmurs of fear and speculation. Miss Marple arrived quietly, observing the scene from a discreet distance. While others fussed over the scorched cooking implements and soot-streaked walls, she noticed something that went entirely unremarked upon. The chimney above the kitchen, though blackened with soot in most homes, remained clean, as if it had seen little or no fire at all. The discrepancy was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it immediately suggested that the fire might not have been entirely accidental. She noted the timing of the outbreak, the frantic movements of the kitchen staff, and the distraction it had caused among the villagers. A minor fire could have been an unfortunate mishap, certainly, but in conjunction with Mr. Brightwell's disappearance, it hinted at something more deliberate, a carefully orchestrated disturbance intended to divert attention or sow confusion. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the kitchen windows, the surrounding snow, and the angles from which the smoke had risen. Her mind traced possibilities, considering who might benefit from such a distraction and how the timing aligned with her earlier observations. The hidden meeting in the garden, the mysterious carriage tracks, and the torn note. Each seemingly minor detail reinforced the pattern she had been building quietly in her mind. While the villagers and staff focused on the chaos of extinguishing the blaze, Miss Marple stood calmly, her knitting basket at her side, noting every subtle sign of misdirection. The clean chimney, the sudden flare of flames, and the panic it provoked all spoke to her trained eye of intent rather than accident. In Willowbrook, she knew, even the smallest events could conceal carefully laid plans, and this second incident confirmed that someone was working meticulously behind the cheerful veneer of holiday festivities. The small drawing room at the vicarage became the center of Willowbrook's speculation that afternoon, as villagers gathered to discuss the recent disturbances. Voices rose in anxious chatter, each person eager to share what they had seen, or thought they had seen, while subtle accusations began to float like mist over the room. Mrs. Pritchard's eyes narrowed at the mention of the fire, and she whispered that Mr. Collins must have been careless. Mrs. Simmons, in turn, hinted that the Vintner family's old rivalry with the Farnsworths might have escalated, suggesting that someone had exploited the tension to cause mischief. Miss Marple, seated in her usual corner, allowed the tumult to wash over her without interruption. She observed the villagers' expressions, the quick glances, the defensive gestures, the slight stammers as they spoke, and catalogued each detail in her mind. She knew that fear and gossip often clouded judgment, transforming ordinary behaviors into misleading signals. Emotional reactions could create convincing illusions, and the smallest misinterpretation might point attention away from the real culprit. Patiently, she began to separate fact from fiction. She cross-referenced what each villager said with her own careful observations. The torn note behind the tree, the late-night meeting in the garden, the carriage tracks in the snow, and even the curious detail of the clean chimney after the kitchen fire. By isolating the most trustworthy accounts, those delivered with calm consistency and corroborated by tangible evidence, she began to see a coherent narrative emerging. Miss Marple smiled quietly to herself, noting how easily the villagers' imaginations had been misled, how the red herrings of jealousy, rivalry, and fear had distracted them from the truth. While others were caught up in speculation, she had begun to reconstruct the sequence of events with precision, guided by careful observation, subtle psychological insight, and the understanding that human motives often revealed themselves only when considered alongside patient scrutiny. In Willowbrook, she reflected, the loudest voices rarely spoke the truth. It was in the quiet, steady attention to detail that real understanding could be found. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple returned to the Farnsworth drawing room, her gaze sweeping over the scattered remnants of the holiday celebration. Candles flickered softly on the mantel, reflecting off the polished surfaces and the glittering ornaments. It was here, near the base of the Christmas tree, that her sharp eyes caught a detail others had overlooked, a small, delicate brooch lying partially hidden beneath the fallen pine needles. The brooch was finely wrought, its design familiar to her from many years of observing village life. Its presence, she realized, was not accidental. Picking it up carefully, she turned it over in her hands, noting the slight smudge of soot along one edge, a faint mark that had previously gone unnoticed, yet now seemed crucial. The brooch connected the minor fire in the kitchen to the disappearance of Mr. Brightwell, forming a bridge between two events that others had treated as isolated incidents. Miss Marple considered the implications. The brooch had been deliberately placed, timed precisely to be discovered after the panic over the fire. Its location and condition suggested an orchestrator who understood the sequence of household routines and who had used the confusion to manipulate perception. Someone had intended to draw attention to trivial disturbances while diverting suspicion from the real act of misdirection. By examining the trinket in the context of the carriage tracks, the torn note, and the secretive garden meeting, Miss Marple began to narrow her list of possible suspects. She noted gestures, timing, and psychological tendencies, identifying who could have executed such careful planning. The seemingly small and insignificant brooch had become a key piece of evidence, a quiet signal revealing both method and motive. In the soft glow of the drawing room, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Where others saw only decoration or coincidence, she discerned the careful hand guiding events, and she now understood the first true link connecting the chaotic incidents. The puzzle piece had fit neatly into place, and the outlines of the orchestrator's plan were beginning to emerge with startling clarity. Chapter 6: The Final Trap. The morning of the village's Christmas breakfast dawned crisp and clear, the sunlight glinting off the freshly fallen snow, casting Willowbrook in a serene, almost magical light. Miss Marple moved quietly through the manor, ensuring that the table was set for the occasion with care. Steaming plates of buttered toast, delicate pastries, and steaming teapots lined the polished mahogany. The festive table, adorned with sprigs of holly and clusters of red berries, reflected the seasonal cheer, yet beneath the warm surface, Miss Marple had a plan quietly taking shape. As the villagers arrived, greeting one another with cheerful smiles and polite banter, Miss Marple welcomed them with her customary warmth. "I thought it might be enlightening," she said, gesturing toward the table, "if we each shared any small observations from the past few days. Sometimes even the simplest remark reveals more than we expect." The villagers, charmed by her gentle invitation and accustomed to her quiet wisdom, complied readily, eager to contribute to what they believed was merely a conversational pastime. One by one, they recounted details, a curious glance here, a sudden movement there, minor disturbances that seemed trivial in isolation. Mrs. Pritchard mentioned the subtle frown she had noticed on a neighbor's face. Mr. Simmons recalled hearing a muffled footstep outside late at night. Each anecdote, shared without suspicion, was catalogued meticulously by Miss Marple, who listened with the patience of a spider weaving a web. She observed not only what was said, but how it was said, the hesitation, the nervous glance, the slight shift in posture. Every reaction, every inflection became a piece of her psychological puzzle. The villagers, unaware that their casual remarks were being carefully analyzed, provided her with more insight than a direct interrogation ever could. By encouraging openness under the guise of curiosity, Miss Marple subtly guided the assembly, turning festive cheer into a stage upon which the truths of Willowbrook might quietly reveal themselves. As the breakfast progressed, she smiled inwardly. The net was being cast gently but effectively, and the patterns of observation and reaction were beginning to converge, drawing her ever closer to unveiling the mystery behind Mr. Brightwell's disappearance. As the breakfast continued, Miss Marple's tone took on a gentle, reflective cadence. She spoke of the strange events surrounding Willowbrook's recent festivities, carefully weaving her words to hint at insights that seemed obvious to no one but her. "It is curious," she said softly, stirring her tea, "how sometimes the smallest details, an overlooked trinket, a footstep in the snow, or even the faint scent of lavender, can tell a story that others might entirely miss." The villagers murmured among themselves, exchanging glances and tentative suggestions. Yet Miss Marple's eyes remained sharp and attentive, scanning each face with the practiced precision of decades spent observing human behavior. She allowed her words to float in the room, like a subtle breeze that set leaves of suspicion in motion, careful not to point fingers, but merely to suggest that someone present held knowledge that had not yet been revealed. Across the table, a slight shift caught her attention. One of the guests, a person previously unassuming and calm, tensed imperceptibly, their fingers tightening around the edge of the tablecloth, a faint flush creeping into their cheeks. They avoided Miss Marple's gaze, their eyes darting nervously to the side as though searching for an escape route. The movement was minute, yet to her it spoke volumes. Anxiety, not guilt alone, could betray the mind struggling to maintain a carefully constructed facade. Miss Marple smiled faintly, noting the instinctive reaction. She did not confront the individual outright. Rather, she allowed the observation to solidify her suspicions. The genuine culprit, she understood, often revealed themselves in the subtlest ways. The twitch of a hand, the quick intake of breath, the hesitation before speaking. By guiding the conversation with quiet hints, she had set the stage and waited for nature to expose the truth. In the calm, festive room, her thoughts raced softly behind the warmth of tea and the gentle murmur of conversation. The web of observation was nearly complete. Soon, she mused, the orchestrator of the mischief would find their own anxiety betraying them, revealing the missing guest's fate and the carefully hidden hand that had shaped the events of Willowbrook's Christmas. Miss Marple leaned back slightly in her chair, the firelight catching the silver threads in her hair, and began recounting a seemingly harmless story from decades past. "Do you remember," she said softly, "the old dispute between the Farnsworths and the vintners over the village green? Such curious times, when even the smallest disagreement seemed to ripple through every household." Her voice was gentle, almost conversational, inviting the villagers to reminisce, while her eyes, sharp and perceptive, scanned the room with quiet intent. The guests responded politely, offering nods and faint chuckles, but one among them, the figure she had already observed reacting with anxiety, shifted uncomfortably. Their fingers drummed nervously against the table, eyes flicking toward Miss Marple, as though anticipating a trap in the gentle narrative. Encouraged, Miss Marple continued, weaving subtle references into her tale, each echoing circumstances remarkably similar to the recent disruptions in the Farnsworth estate. Sudden disturbances, secret meetings, and miscommunications that benefited one party while casting suspicion on another. As the story unfolded, the anxious guest could no longer contain themselves. In attempting to correct the narrative and clarify their knowledge, they inadvertently revealed details that no one outside the true events could have known. The timing of certain actions, the precise movement of individuals, and even the deliberate misplacement of a small object intended to distract attention. Miss Marple noted each slip with calm precision, her mind arranging the facts into the coherent pattern that had eluded the villagers and constable alike. Finally, with a gentle but unwavering tone, she addressed the individual. Now I understand. That explains so much of what puzzled us all." The guest, realizing their inadvertent confession, paled and lowered their gaze, caught in the quiet yet inescapable web of observation. The room remained calm, festive even, yet in that subtle exchange, the truth had emerged. No raised voices or accusations were necessary. Miss Marple's patient guidance and careful storytelling had allowed the culprit to betray themselves voluntarily. In Willowbrook, she reflected, the most delicate pressure, applied with wisdom and kindness, was often enough to uncover the deepest secrets. Chapter 7. The Reveal. The villagers gathered once more in the Farnsworth drawing room, the fire crackling gently and casting a warm glow over their expectant faces. Miss Marple sat in her favorite armchair, knitting neatly in her lap, yet her eyes sparkled with quiet authority. "Now, my dears," she began softly, "let us consider the curious events that have unsettled our peaceful village this Christmas." She allowed a pause, giving her listeners a moment to settle into attentive silence. Their curiosity piqued. She began to recount the sequence of events, careful to draw attention to the subtle details that had so easily been overlooked. The fresh carriage tracks in the snow, she explained, indicated an unexpected arrival at the estate, suggesting that someone had manipulated the household's routines. The torn note behind the Christmas tree, with its faint scent of lavender, hinted at personal motives and concealed tensions. Even the arrangement of ornaments on the Christmas tree, she continued, revealed subconscious reminders of old rivalries, carefully staged to communicate intent without speaking aloud. As she spoke, Miss Marple wove these disparate observations into a coherent narrative. She described the minor kitchen fire, emphasizing the clean chimney as evidence of deliberate misdirection. The anxious gestures and nervous glances of the butler and other villagers, she explained, had misled many, creating a convenient smokescreen for the true orchestrator. She highlighted how even the smallest trinket, the brooch found under the tree, had provided a crucial link between seemingly separate incidents. The villagers listened in astonishment, marveling at how what had appeared trivial, the footprint, a misplaced letter, a nervous glance, had actually held the key to understanding the mystery. Each subtle clue, once carefully examined, painted a portrait of deliberate planning and human psychology, revealing motives, misdirection, and the steps that led to Mr. Brightwell's disappearance. By the time Miss Marple finished recounting the puzzle pieces, the room was hushed, the villagers' amazement tangible. They saw now how easy it had been to overlook what was plainly visible, how human nature, fear, and assumption had obscured the truth, and how patient observation, careful reasoning, and an understanding of the smallest details could illuminate even the most perplexing mysteries. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her knitting resting forgotten in her lap, as she addressed the gathered villagers with calm authority. "Now, it is essential to understand not only what occurred, but why," she began, her voice gentle yet unwavering. Human behavior, as you know, often conceals its intentions beneath layers of politeness and routine. In this case, the culprit's actions were guided by a combination of greed, jealousy, and a desire to assert control over matters best left untouched. She paused, allowing her words to settle, then described the motivations in detail. The individual had envied Mr. Brightwell's position within the Farnsworth household and sought to manipulate the Christmas gathering to their advantage. Past slights and perceived injustices had compounded, creating a simmering resentment that manifested in careful planning. Miss Marple emphasized how subtle psychological pressure had been applied to ensure that others, particularly the dutiful butler, appeared suspicious, deflecting attention from the true orchestrator. Turning to the method itself, Miss Marple outlined each step of the plan with precision. The clandestine carriage arrival, The hidden garden meeting and the calculated placement of the brooch were all clever devices designed to manipulate perception. Even the minor fire in the kitchen served as a distraction, drawing the household's eyes away from the more important movements of the culprit. Each action, she explained, demonstrated foresight and cunning, yet none were executed flawlessly. Tiny oversights, the clean chimney, the anxious glance at the Christmas breakfast, the subtle inconsistency in the timing of certain events, revealed cracks in the plan that, to a careful observer, were impossible to ignore. The villagers listened with rapt attention, marveling at how easily the clever plot had deceived them and how small human errors had unraveled it. Miss Marple's explanation illuminated not just the criminal actions, but the vulnerabilities of human nature, demonstrating that even the most meticulous schemes leave traces for those patient and perceptive enough to notice. By understanding motive and method together, she explained, the full picture of the Christmas mystery emerged, leaving no room for doubt. The room fell into a gentle hush as Miss Marple's words settled over the villagers. All eyes turned toward the anxious figure she had subtly guided into revealing themselves. With a composed, almost fragile dignity, the culprit took a steadying breath and admitted their actions. "It is true," they said softly. "I orchestrated the events surrounding Mr. Brightwell's disappearance. I allowed envy and desire for control to cloud my judgment, and I misled those I should have trusted." The admission, quiet yet complete, carried a weight of responsibility that silenced any murmurs of outrage. Even as the confession echoed in the room, a stir of excitement and relief passed through the assembly. Moments later, Mr. Theodore Brightwell appeared in the doorway, safe and unharmed, his coat dusted with snow from a brief retreat to a distant guest house arranged by the culprit. The missing guest's cheerful greeting and calm demeanor reassured the villagers, their earlier anxieties dissolving into heartfelt relief. Laughter and light conversation slowly returned, the festive spirit of Willowbrook reasserting itself after days of tension and uncertainty. Miss Marple observed quietly from her corner, her knitting resting on her lap, reflecting on the delicate interplay of human nature she had witnessed. She considered how pride, fear, and ambition could lead even the most measured individuals into error, and how easily assumptions could misdirect suspicion. Yet, she also noted the enduring kindness and resilience of her neighbors, their capacity to recover and extend understanding even after deception had caused upheaval. With the mystery resolved, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, thoughtful smile. The web of observation, patience, and subtle guidance had brought clarity to events that initially seemed impenetrable. She quietly reminded herself, and perhaps the villagers, that truth often resides in the smallest gestures, the overlooked details, and the careful attention one pays when others are distracted by noise and conjecture. In Willowbrook, as in life, the art of noticing quietly, patiently, and compassionately could illuminate the darkest of secrets, restoring harmony and understanding where confusion had once prevailed. Chapter 8. Christmas Restored. By the late afternoon, the Farnsworth estate was alive with warmth, laughter, and the gentle glow of candlelight dancing across polished wood and festive decorations. The villagers had gathered once more around the grand Christmas tree, its branches adorned with glittering ornaments, silver tinsel, and the faint scent of pine mingling with the rich aroma of freshly baked cakes. Music played softly in the background, and the air was filled with the cheerful chatter of neighbors who had spent the morning in anxious reflection, now eager to embrace the joy of the season. Miss Marple, seated near the fire with her knitting basket beside her, observed the scene with quiet satisfaction. She had suggested earlier in her soft and persuasive way, that the villagers used this renewed gathering as an opportunity to soften old grievances and misunderstandings. "Remember, my dears," she had said, "the spirit of Christmas often lies not just in gifts or decoration, but in the patience and forgiveness we extend to one another." Her words had been met with nods, and slowly, one by one, old grudges began to melt away. Neighbors who had once whispered sharp remarks now exchanged warm greetings, offering small apologies for past slights, their faces bright with relief and genuine goodwill. Children giggled as they placed a final ornament on the tree, while adults shared stories and reminiscences, recalling fond memories of Christmases past. The tensions that had shadowed the village for weeks seemed to dissolve in the gentle glow of firelight, the subtle harmony of music, and the laughter that rang through the hall. Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile, appreciating the transformation. The simple acts of conversation, acknowledgement, and gentle guidance had restored not only order, but the warmth of community. Willowbrook, once tense and shadowed by fear and suspicion, now radiated the calm joy of togetherness. The villagers had been reminded that even amidst human folly and hidden motives, understanding, forgiveness, and shared celebration could rekindle harmony, leaving their little corner of England wrapped in the true spirit of Christmas. Night had settled over Willowbrook, and the village lay cloaked in a soft blanket of snow, the quiet only broken by the occasional crunch of a late passerby or the distant toll of the church bell. Inside the Farnsworth estate, the last of the guests had departed, leaving the house steeped in the gentle warmth of a fire that crackled and hissed in the hearth. Miss Marple settled into her favorite armchair, knitting needles clicking softly, the wool sliding smoothly between her fingers. The room was still, but her mind was anything but idle. She reflected on the events that had unfolded over the past few days. The disappearance of Mr. Brightwell, the clandestine meetings, the subtle clues that had gone unnoticed by all but her, and the careful orchestration of both mischief and revelation. She considered the villagers' reactions, fear, gossip, and misjudgment, and how easily people could be led astray by appearances alone. Yet in the midst of the chaos, she had observed small acts of kindness, the gentle persistence of truth-seeking, and the quiet patience required to understand human behavior. Miss Marple mused that anger and suspicion often cloud judgment, leading to false conclusions and unnecessary tension. In contrast, quiet observation, a careful attention to detail, and a compassionate understanding of human nature could reveal the truth in ways that confrontation never could. The simple gestures of those around her, the hesitant glance, the nervous fidget, the slip of a word, had all provided insight when interpreted with patience and empathy. As the firelight danced across the polished floorboards and the shadows of holly branches swayed gently on the walls, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, contented sigh. In Willowbrook, as in life, the deepest truths were rarely shouted. They emerged quietly, through careful attention, understanding, and the gentle interplay of human kindness. Knitting slowly, she smiled to herself, knowing that the village's harmony had been restored not through force or accusation, but through the steady, observant eye of one who valued patience, discretion, and the subtle art of noticing the smallest details. The morning after the Christmas festivities dawned clear and bright, the snow glinting like scattered diamonds over the rooftops of Willowbrook. Villagers moved about with light hearts and renewed cheer, sharing warm greetings and laughter as they resumed their daily routines. Yet beneath this surface of calm and celebration lay the subtle lessons of the recent events, lessons that Miss Marple had quietly imparted through her observations and guidance. Gathered informally at the market and in homes along the village lanes, Neighbors spoke not only of the joy of restored festivities, but of the truths they had witnessed. They had seen firsthand how appearances could deceive, a calm demeanor masking anxiety, a polite gesture concealing intent, or a small trinket revealing a carefully orchestrated plan. They recognized that even the tiniest actions, an overlooked note, a casual glance, or a seemingly trivial observation, could have profound effects, influencing the course of events in ways they had scarcely imagined. Miss Marple, seated in her cozy armchair with her knitting basket at her side, reflected on these insights with quiet satisfaction. Her gentle wisdom had not only solved the mystery of the missing guest, but had restored harmony and the true spirit of Christmas to Willowbrook. She understood that patience, kindness, and careful attention often spoke louder than confrontation or accusation, and that the human heart revealed its truths most clearly to those willing to observe with empathy and discretion. The villagers, grateful for her guidance, carried this understanding forward in their interactions, offering apologies, extending forgiveness, and cherishing the bonds of community. Even the faintest tensions of past rivalries had softened, replaced by warmth, laughter, and the quiet reassurance of mutual respect. As the sun climbed higher over the snow-dusted cottages, Miss Marple sat quietly by her window, watching the village bustle and reflecting on the enduring lessons of Willowbrook. In the gentle rhythm of everyday life, she noted, the smallest gestures, the subtlest insights, and the careful observance of human nature could illuminate truths otherwise hidden, leaving the village wiser, more compassionate, and enveloped in the lingering warmth of a Christmas restored. Willowbrook, now free from the anxieties that had shadowed its festive celebrations, gleamed beneath the soft glow of a wintry evening. Chimneys sent gentle curls of smoke into the crisp night air, and lanterns cast golden halos along the snow-dusted streets. Inside the Farnsworth estate, the fire crackled merrily, illuminating the cheerful faces of villagers who had gathered once more to celebrate Christmas in peace and good humor. Laughter echoed through the halls, mingling with the soft strains of carolers singing just outside, while the scent of mulled cider and spiced cakes lingered warmly in every corner. Miss Marple sat in her favorite armchair, knitting quietly, her sharp eyes reflecting both the flickering flames and the satisfaction of a mystery resolved. She lifted her gaze to the audience with a gentle smile. "My dears," she said softly, "it is remarkable how often the smallest details, an overlooked glance, a subtle word, or a humble trinket, can reveal truths we might otherwise miss. I wonder, in your own villages or neighborhoods, what little signs go unnoticed, what quiet stories lie just beneath the surface." She encouraged viewers to share any small, uncanny observations in the comments, inviting them into the timeless charm of community life and the subtle mysteries it sometimes holds. Pausing, she allowed a moment of reflection, her knitting needles moving rhythmically. "There is something enduring in village life," she continued, "a warmth, a kindness, and occasionally a mystery that reminds us how fascinating the ordinary can be. It is in these quiet corners, in the gentle interplay of people and their surroundings, that truths emerge if one only watches carefully." With a soft chuckle and a nod, Miss Marple concluded, "Thank you for joining me in Willowbrook this Christmas. May your own hearths glow warmly, and may curiosity and care guide you as gently as they guide me. Until our next tale, my dears, good night, and a very Merry Christmas to all."